If you think one projected stat line can tell the story of an entire game, think again. Heading into Thursday's matchup between the Chicago Sky and the Indiana Fever, one of the biggest talking points isn't just who will win. It's whether Caitlin Clark can live up to a projection that has her scoring 19 points. At first glance, that number might seem reasonable. But when you look deeper, it opens up a much bigger conversation about expectations, defensive adjustments, team dynamics, and the pressure that follows one of the most talked about players in basketball. So is 19 points the right prediction? Is it too high, too low, or does it completely miss what could decide this game? Let's break it down. The Indiana Fever and Chicago Sky have quickly become one of the most discussed matchups in the WNBA. Part of that is because of the growing rivalry between the teams, and part of it comes from the attention surrounding players like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. Whenever these teams meet, fans, analysts, and media outlets closely examine every detail. Going into Thursday's game, various projections and prediction models have estimated that Clark could finish with around 19 points. It's important to remember that projections are not guarantees. They're statistical estimates based on previous performance, usage rates, shooting efficiency, opponent defense, and other measurable factors. Still, the projection itself has sparked conversation. For some fans, 19 points sounds conservative. After all, Clark has shown throughout her basketball career that she can score in bunches and take over games offensively. Her shooting range forces defenses to guard her well beyond the three-point line, creating challenges few players can consistently solve. Others argue that 19 points may actually be a realistic expectation considering the defensive attention she receives every night. And that's where the discussion becomes interesting. One thing that often gets lost when people evaluate Clark's scoring numbers is the amount of defensive pressure she faces. Opposing teams frequently design game plans specifically around limiting her impact. Defenders pick her up early, fight through screens aggressively, and attempt to force the ball out of her hands. Because of that, scoring projections cannot simply be based on talent alone. Basketball is ultimately a game of adjustments. If Chicago focuses heavily on containing Clark, it could reduce her scoring opportunities. But that strategy might also create open looks for Indiana's other players. In that scenario, Clark's influence on the game could remain enormous even if she scores fewer than the projected 19 points. That's one reason why raw point totals don't always tell the full story. A player can have a tremendous impact through passing, floor spacing, decision-making, and leadership without necessarily posting a huge scoring number. According to recent discussions among analysts and fans, one of the biggest questions entering this matchup is whether Clark will prioritize scoring or playmaking. Indiana's offense has evolved throughout the season, and there are moments when Clark becomes more of a facilitator than a pure scorer. When defenses collapse on her, she often creates opportunities for teammates rather than forcing difficult shots. If that trend continues, it could affect whether the 19-point projection becomes reality. On the other side, Chicago has its own priorities. The Sky know that limiting transition opportunities is critical. Clark thrives when the pace increases and the defense is forced to react quickly. When Indiana gets out and runs, Clark's ability to shoot from distance and make advanced passing reads becomes especially dangerous. Chicago's defensive discipline could therefore play a major role in determining whether Clark exceeds expectations. But here's another layer that deserves attention. The conversation surrounding Clark often becomes centered entirely on offense. Yet some of her most valuable contributions come from how she influences defensive positioning before she even touches the ball. Defenders are constantly aware of where she is on the floor. That gravity changes spacing and creates opportunities for teammates. In simple terms, Clark can affect possessions even when she doesn't score. That's why evaluating her performance solely based on whether she reaches 19 points may overlook what actually matters. Now let's talk about fan reactions. Whenever projections involving Clark appear online, reactions tend to be strong. Some fans immediately predict she'll surpass the number comfortably. They point to her shooting ability, confidence, and track record of producing big moments under pressure. Others are more cautious. They note that every opponent treats games against Indiana as significant matchups and often brings heightened defensive intensity. Reports suggest that many fans view the projection as a reasonable middle ground. It's high enough to reflect Clark's offensive talent, but not so high that it ignores the realities of WNBA defenses. What's fascinating is how expectations continue to evolve. When Clark entered the league, much of the attention focused on whether her game would translate to the professional level. As time has passed, the conversation has shifted. Now many discussions aren't about whether she can succeed. They're about how much she can achieve. That's a very different type of pressure. Instead of being evaluated against rookie expectations, she's often measured against star-level standards. And that context matters when discussing a projection like 19 points. For many players, a 19-point performance would be considered an outstanding offensive night. For Clark, some fans might view it as average simply because expectations have become so high. That says as much about public perception as it does about basketball. Let's take the analysis one step further. Suppose Clark scores exactly 19 points. Would that automatically mean she played well? Not necessarily. If those points come inefficiently while the offense struggles, the number alone may not indicate a strong performance. Now imagine a different scenario. Clark scores only 14 points but records several assists, controls the pace, and helps Indiana secure a win. Many coaches would likely value that performance just as highly, if not more. This is why context is everything. Basketball outcomes are rarely determined by a single statistic. For Indiana, the larger objective is winning games and continuing to build consistency. Individual scoring numbers matter, but they exist within a bigger picture. The same applies to Chicago. The Sky are focused on executing their game plan, controlling tempo, and creating advantages wherever possible. Their success won't depend solely on whether Clark reaches a specific scoring total. Instead, it will depend on how effectively they manage all of Indiana's offensive threats. Another factor worth monitoring is momentum throughout the game. Sometimes scoring projections look accurate for 3 quarters and then change dramatically in the fourth. A player can enter the final period with 12 points and suddenly finish with 24 after a late scoring surge. Clark has demonstrated the ability to produce those types of stretches throughout her career. That's one reason predictions remain challenging. Basketball is unpredictable by nature. Hot shooting nights happen. Defensive adjustments happen. Foul trouble happens. Game flow changes. A projection represents probability, not certainty. And that's exactly why fans continue paying attention. The uncertainty creates intrigue. As Thursday's matchup approaches, the projected 19-point mark serves as an interesting reference point rather than a definitive expectation. It provides a benchmark for discussion, but the actual story will be written on the court. Will Clark find scoring opportunities early and build momentum? Will Chicago's defense force the ball out of her hands? Will Indiana's supporting cast create enough offensive balance to prevent defensive overload? Those questions may ultimately prove more important than the projection itself. At the end of the day, the most compelling part of this matchup isn't whether a statistical model gets the number exactly right. It's seeing how two competitive teams respond under pressure and how star players adapt when the game demands adjustments. Because in basketball, the most important moments are often the ones nobody predicted. And that's where we'll leave the discussion. Do you think Caitlin Clark will score more than the projected 19 points against the Chicago Sky? Or will her biggest impact come in other areas of the game that don't always show up in the scoring column?